where archaeology meets mortality. Archaeodeath.
Welcome everybody to this Mortuary Memes event, which is a workshop following on from our Theoretical Archaeology Group conference, which we had in December 2024. And here we are 2 months on, and we thought we'd have an opportunity to get together the speakers that could attend in Bournemouth and those that couldn't, who gave wonderful digital deliveries on a digital topic, as well as those of us that met in Bournemouth and had a chinwag in the session and afterwards. And it was a packed room. They gave us the smallest room, so it felt packed, and it was a really good session. And I saw some other great sessions at TAG, and we wanted to have a sort of follow-up. So we're recording this. We're going to put it on at least 2 YouTube channels so that it appears in different places for different audiences. So Vanessa and my own channels, and we might share it elsewhere if people are willing and keen. But the idea is to follow on this discussion of the public archaeology of death, or death, and particularly in relation to digital environments, and how the many challenges we face communicating via those environments, and the ethics of trying to deal with sensitive topics in such a global, online, complex environment. And so just to remind you of the rough schedule, this was the kind of idea we had in mind, and just so that that we're going to do a follow-up Mortuary Memes with some of the people who couldn't make it tonight, and also some additional speakers who couldn't make either the digital or the in-person sessions at TAG in Bournemouth. So we're going to do follow-ups, and we may keep going and just do more Mortuary Memes forever, and we'll be here in 2030 on Mortuary Memes 84B or something. But at the moment, we just wanted to do a few follow-up sessions to have these discussions. So I don't know if Ellie, you want to add anything as by way of introduction before we hand over the reins of power to Steph and Owen to see us through this structure?
I was going to say, on that note, though, of being here forever, that's how Hannah Cobb and I started off with our virtual online roundtables, was just taking our session online. That was 5 years ago.
Well, exactly. And this we wanted to keep private, even though we were going to share it all publicly afterwards, because I found particularly stressful trying to do lives where you've got comments coming in. And so we wanted it to be a kind of private event in the terms of audience. It's just us, but we are going to, obviously, we want to make this an open debate. We want to, as with the conference, we want to share this and receive feedback and comments. So yeah, we'll see how this goes.
You've kind of covered everything. If we do carry on forever and ever, and we might come up with slightly better names, because we appreciate Mortuary Memes too is slightly on the nose. But it does what it says on the tin. I think you said about like having a sort of smaller group of people, and obviously the original conference session was open to anyone to contribute, and now we're basing this session off that, and then we'll roll it out more. But just to acknowledge that we've got a group of people who are invested and are researching mortuary archaeology online, either as critics, kind of evaluating the content that is out there, or as critical creators. We do have, obviously, yourself, Howard, and some other people who are out there putting their faces into the social web and with all of the issues that comes with that. So hopefully we'll be able to get into a lot of various different conversations around that. But now I think we can pass over to our 2 chairs, who have very generously offered to share for us today.
Yeah, thank you, Howard and Ellie, for organising this. I like the name Mortuary Memes too. We'll just, I guess we'll see where it leads. And thanks for the invite to chair. I think what we decided, Steph, over email was we're going to alternate. So I don't know if you want to start first. Obviously, we'll let everyone do their introductions, but
because I think that was what we had kind of said, is that it would be a bit of a split between us. But yeah, we can start with introductions. I think that'll be easiest. Do you want to introduce yourself first, and then I can go around?
No, we'll do me, then you, and then we can just point at people and pick on them. So I'm Owen. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a PhD student at the University of York. If we have to do institutional, financial affiliations or whatever, I'm funded by the AHRC through the White Rose College of Arts and Humanities, as well as the Leverhulme Trust through the Heritage for Global Challenges Research Centre. It's a lot. They're all acronyms as well, which makes the email signatures a lot of fun. But I kind of have a bit of a potentially an easier job in terms of mortuary memes because I'm not a content creator. I'm one of those people that looks. I mean, I think I create content. I write papers and blog posts, but I don't have traditional what you would imagine when it's content creation. I kind of look at it from the perspective of it as public archaeology. What it means for the discipline, how it affects public understanding and dissemination. And through my particular research, which is in gender archaeology, focusing on beyond the binary genders, I look at the ways archaeology is used by the alt-right to attract trans people and to push anti-trans policy, which was part of what I presented at TAG. And as of today, I have just submitted that as a formal paper. So I can keep people pending on publication moving forward. But I'll pass on to you now, Steph.
I feel like I'm going to come across as not as professional as Owen after that kind of quite elaborate introduction. But yeah, I'm Steph. I'm a third-year PhD student at Durham University. And I mean, my actual research has got nothing to do with mortuaries or memes. They're simply settlement intensification in Iron Age Southeast Arabia. And I'm not funded at all, which is a great joy that causes me absolutely no stress. But sort of my connection to mortuary memes is the fact that I am a creator. I always find it a bit weird and awkward saying that. I'm like, what does that mean, a creator? But I suppose it's the easiest term to be using. And yeah, I have been creating content on TikTok for almost 5.5 years now, and a lot of it is centered around death, I suppose, to put it bluntly. And so I guess I presented was actually one of my videos because I wanted to kind of highlight how even really short form content like the stuff I'm producing is in the 15-second realm. Even that does have some capacity, I think, to have a somewhat nuanced conversation about ethics of human remains and kind of put out to the general public some of the conversations which are often happening within academic spaces, but that people might not be aware that are being had. So yeah, that's kind of, in a very roundabout way, how I'm connected.
Great, thank you. I mean, people have disappeared. I'm not sure if it's just my bandwidth trying to like not overload it good. I'll pass on to Ellie then. I think there was who's next on my screen.
Yeah, great. I'm also a PhD student, also not funded, so we can have a separate conversation about how fun that is. But I am at the University of Chester. Howard is my supervisor, which is how we have the background that we do and why we decided to run a session together at the conference. My PhD topic is looking at bioarchaeology and popular culture, specifically in the online news media. So I sort of identified, from my background as a bioarchaeologist, there's a lot of bioarchaeology in the online news, and it's really a form of public archaeology more generally, not just for bioarchaeology, that isn't acknowledged properly, I would say, in archaeology. There's a lot of content that goes into the online news that has a huge audience that has just sort of been created as like an advert for a university or to promote like very exceptional finds, and that can then lead to these really problematic narratives being communicated on a really mass scale. So I've recently, well, at the end of last year, had a journal article published that was trying to get archaeologists to pay more attention to the online news as a form of public engagement and try and take some sort of responsibility for the way that narratives are communicated in the online news. And my PhD is addressing that, but also specifically through bioarchaeology because of the changes, similar to Owen, towards social justice research in bioarchaeology. I've been addressing more about research that looks at Britishness, British identity, and especially whiteness and how that relates to the race science that we see kind of getting propagated across archaeology at the moment, well, bioarchaeology. So yeah, my research is kind of using that public output to try and evaluate how the bioarchaeology is working. And when you're talking about social justice research, you have to talk about the public output and the public engagement, because that's the whole point of it, is to try and change public opinion So I'm trying to understand how those things all work together, and I've got about 4 months to go, so I'm very near the end now. So yeah, nearly there. And for the session that we spoke about, I specifically looked at the ethics of using images of human remains in online news websites, which I know we'll get back to later, but that's kind of more broadly what my thesis or my research looks at.
Great, thank you. Next, I've got Vanessa.
Okay, hi, thank you, Howard and Ali, for inviting me. So I'm a bioanthropologist and a content curator of BioAnt Talks on YouTube. And initially, my research was more about understanding aging in adults and more exactly on the pelvic joints, trying to understand what factors affect the rate of aging, such as body size and occupation. But on recent years, my research has expanded into ethical questions, as it has for a lot of professionals in bioanthropology. I'm mostly interested in ethical concerns associated with identified human remains collections and also the 3D digitalization of our ancestors' remains, which are easily accessible online, and you can even buy on Etsy, for example, a crafts and arts website. I'm also interested in the history of the discipline and gender discrimination concerns in science, especially for mothers. Since I became a mother, I have felt some structural discrimination more in place, not just as a woman, but as a mother. Regarding for TAG, I examined how human remains are portrayed on YouTube and the public reaction to it. This is a preliminary study. I analyzed 244 comments, and what I saw was the use of human remains images on video thumbnails, and I imagine it's to increase viewership, appealing to morbid curiosity. And I have seen some videos that they use human remains as background props. They're not even mentioned, but they're just props. Regarding public comments, it's quite interesting, the diverse perspectives the public have regarding the content. But something I did not disclose, and before I forget, I didn't mention this in my talk, but there was a lot of comments alluding to ancient DNA analysis. And it was kind of like it was a supreme tool that can disclose full biographical information about past individuals. And so it shows that the public does not fully understand this analysis, the ethical concerns associated. And so this is something for us to consider in our outreach practices. Okay.
Great, thank you very much. Next, I've got Karina.
Hi, I'm Karina Croucher. So I'm based at the University of Bradford, Professor of Archaeology, Health and Wellbeing in the School of Archaeological and Forensic Sciences. So my research and what I talked about in the TAG paper is presenting actually what's a lot of collaborative research and interdisciplinary research, which looks at how funerary archaeology and the dead can help communities today to talk more easily about death, dying, bereavement and loss. So obviously it's quite a sensitive topic, and looking at things from the distance and moved past can really open up the gateways. So thinking about the kind of public archaeology or funerary archaeology in that context, and as a consequence, we've developed various online digital resources. And in fact, one of our projects working with secondary schools in Dying to Talk, we just started the project when COVID hit. So we ended up having to transfer the whole project to be delivered online. And as a consequence, we ended up with digital outputs, which was interesting. The same with the Continuing Bonds Toolkit. Again, it was originally designed as a kind of workshop CPD, and we ended up creating an online toolkit for counsellors and psychologists. So yeah, I'll pause there because as Howard knows, I could talk about this for hours, but I won't. So yeah, I'll pause.
No, thank you. Now, last but not least, pass on to Solange, who looks like you're enjoying some kind of alpine retreat.
That's great. Oh, I wish. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I'm Solange Bowling. I kind of have two hats here. I have a bioarchaeology background. I have a PhD from Bradford, and Karina was one of my PhD supervisors. But I sort of transitioned into, not fully, keeping my options open, but I transitioned into, I did a digital archaeology MSc at the University of York, and then now I'm currently working as a digital archives assistant at the Archaeology Data Service, or the ADS. So in terms of what I talked about at TAG, the talk I presented discussed sort of online dissemination of digital bioarchaeological data using the ADS as a case study. So we're talking spreadsheets that can contain osteological data, and then 2D and 3D visualizations of human remains. And all of this type of stuff can be deposited with the ADS. So in case you're not familiar with the ADS, this is a tongue twister, a UK-based Core Trust Seal accredited digital repository for archaeological and historic environment data. So we mostly get stuff from UK-based archaeological excavations and projects that are either developer funded, which is most of them, or research-based. So I guess long story short, I developed an online Qualtrics survey that looked at how ADS can sort of appropriately disseminate this type of sensitive data. And the results helped me form several suggestions for how the ADS might proceed with this type of dissemination. So the first was that they should implement pop-up content advisories before users can view human remains. I know pop-up content advisories have been a bit controversial in the past, but that's what came out of my results. Second, they should provide archive-specific ethics statements for archives that include data from human remains. The third one was they should include a pop-up box that requests that people remember that the data that they're downloading comes from once living humans, and that they try to reuse the data with regard for the identity of the deceased. And then the final and most kind of the one that I focus on the most was that if it can be made manageable with regards to time and cost, the ADS should provide as much contextual information as possible alongside 3D models of human remains. So this could include, links to excavation photographs, drawings, context sheets, a searchable map interface for grave location, and then if you receive it, like the post-excavational osteological analysis. So the unfortunate part of this is that process is really complex and requires a lot of time to complete. So in my talk, I sort of suggest that the cost to archive and disseminate a bioarchaeological archive to that standard needs to be passed on to the depositors. So commercial archaeology companies that are planning to submit bids for, really excavation of really large cemeteries, they need to factor in increased archival costs to the developers when they send their bid in. And then this way, if we do it this way, it'll allow for the resulting ADS archive to be disseminated as a special collection with sort of a custom interface that appreciates the sensitivity and uniqueness of the bioarchaeological data. And this approach ensures that the archaeology company and the developer are promoting best practice with regards to digital sharing. And it will also make their data much more reusable in the future. And most importantly, it will help to humanize the skeletons behind the data. So yeah, sorry, bit of a ramble, but.
All right, thank you. So that's everyone introduced. So I am going to now pass on to Steph, who's going to lead the next part of this this Mortuary Memes 2.
Yeah, so the next point is sort of about the potentials and pitfalls as creators of digital public archaeological content. But from what everyone's kind of been saying, it's not so many creators here at the moment. So I feel like I might ask you all to kind of maybe shift your thinking or ask some questions, and we'll see how this goes. But I did want to ask Vanessa, because about sort of the work you've done and your research, like what do you think are some of those pitfalls which creators can fall into in digital public spaces?
That is a great question. One of the pitfalls is trying to use the images of deceased individuals in a way that they try to gain viewership, and forgetting that this was a person. We need to show respect. Because you can find a lot of, for example, on YouTube, how to create thumbnails that attract viewership. So if you put a human remain on the thumbnail, people will be more interested. But there's no context. And what is the educational value of putting a human remain on the thumbnail? Or using a human remain just as a prop on the back? I have seen in this preliminary research that most that use human remains as props were interviews, like of big names, and they were having a skeleton or an image of a skeleton on their computer as a background prop. It has no educational value. It brings no value for the interview. The only videos at the moment, mind you, this was preliminary, the only videos that did not show human remains, the topic was about ethics. So they did not have image of human remains.
That's very interesting, actually, that you said that they sort of haven't been included. So do you think that then the issue is creators or the human remains are being used for the kind of the shock value, or like the sort of like curiosity element, and then that's going to draw people into watching the content? And do you think then if human remains are going to be used in videos, should there be like more information about the individuals, or as much as can be done, or do you think that they should just not be at all?
I think it really depends on the context. And yes, there's some that abuse showing because they want viewership. And I have seen an historian that sometimes she also, to increase viewership, she puts some misinformation, trying to gain that viewership. And it's a very speculative kind of YouTube channel, which I do not like. I can give you the example of my channel, and it's something I'm debating. Like, for example, I do not put image of human remains on thumbnails. If I show image of human remains, it has to have an educational value, justification why it's there. Context is very important. And I also put a warning the viewers, this video shows human remains. So for those that are sensitive, please don't. That way they have an informed decision if they want to see my video or not. Because some people do not want to see human remains online, so they can make an informed decision. And I think who we are showing online is very important. We cannot also forget that a lot of our collections are individuals that come from marginalized communities, that come from social economic backgrounds that are lower when they lived, so they had less power to protect their bodies after death, in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, no, I think
those
those are I agree. Those are like good points, and I think it's definitely something that I think about when it comes to my content, because for a while I was like, I'm absolutely not putting any human remains, but then what I was finding is because I was like looking for like maybe artist representations or artist interpretations of graves, so rather than showing the actual remains themselves. But then what I was coming up against was a lack of data online. And so that's what I kind of wanted to ask Solange, like about the work that you're doing and sort of having almost a database with all of that, or as much information as there can be about human remains. Do you think that that is a resource which can be or will be open to like non-specialist people? or will it just be restricted to researchers? Because I certainly see there being an appetite for mortuary content, and I think people are, they might not know all the ethics, but people certainly do recognize, that there should be, or not everyone, but some people do recognize that there should be some ethics around human remains. Like, what do you think about that from
coming from the ADS point of view? We are open access, so anyone will be able to access. Basically, what you'll see is you'll have the 3D model, and you can download those files. But what I'm arguing for is that on that page with the 3D models, below it is linked any other files that we have that provide as much information as we were given. So a lot of times it'll be the contact sheets. Those are quite interesting to see, because it sometimes has what's the word, excavators, comments and stuff like that, as well, photographs of the graves. And then, like, ideally you would also have the osteological analysis that happens after the fact, also deposited with us, so that can come up, because at the moment some of the stuff we have from HS2, they haven't been analyzed properly, so it's kind of like what the people thought in the moment. So they look like they were a large skeleton, so they're probably male and things like that. But I think the contact sheets and the photographs as well, for sure, with in terms of grave goods and stuff, showing that type of context. So I think technically, yes, the public would have access to those. Whether or not, I don't think, random people are going to end up on the ADS website. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I think in terms of reuse of those models and images, it's not like it wouldn't be allowed, but as I said, I think it would need, but what you were saying about with your content, like you will provide images or something, but when there's context. So I think we would be okay with that. Well, personally, I would be okay if you were sharing it, as long as as much contextual information is there that's possible, and that the point of the post is educational, just morbid curiosity. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I suppose that's one risk that we run, because you don't have to have like an account or anything. So that was why I was trying to implement the idea of the pop-up that comes when you click to download. It's not been implemented, and again, it was just a suggestion on my part. But the hope was that, with that little extra box, you just remind people, remember, whatever you're going to do with this, remember that it came from a living human, and try and reuse it with respect for their identity. That then we run into the problem of respect is subjective in all different cultures and time periods, but that's a whole other story, I guess. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well, like something like that can be really useful for dealing with misinformation, especially like online when it comes to human remains, because often you'll get people, I mean, not everything gets reported in the news. So I know I've definitely made videos about content. People have been like, actually, that's not right, because I read this article from 2014. And I'm like, well, I read the most recent one in 2021 that actually said this. And I think that's part of it. Like often, I mean, it's not like I've got any stats on it, but I do feel like that news about human remains for archaeology gets pushed more. So it's what kind of gets seen a lot. So I think having a resource like that, where even when creators are making content, they can have, like, I like having facts in my videos. I like being able to say like specific things rather than just being like, look at these bones. Isn't it cool? But I mean, like, Howard, you as well, like you create a lot of, obviously mortuary related content. I mean, do you see what Solange is doing, like this kind of work, as useful to what you're doing, or as an asset to sort of help you maybe avoid some pitfalls and stuff?
I think it's a very different world at one level between sort of a digital database and a sort of online content creation. And I imagine that actually at one level, in the current format of many of these videos, you might not see a connection. But if you can provide connections to open access resources because there is a thirst, not for everyone, but there is a thirst for that depth of information. And one of the most frustrating things about many museum websites, many university websites, is that shallow depth, that presumption of superficiality, which we're almost buying into in archaeology. And if I can do more videos, which as a creator, that are not simply connect to a news story or even a peer-reviewed publication that may be open access, but to actually the data sets themselves, and say, here, let's talk about two individuals from an early medieval cemetery in Wales. And in doing so, we obviously put some context. We were able to put the reference to the resource. This is a real value to us, and there is a thirst for that depth and knowledge. And also, I think there's a great hunger for that that responsible use. And yes, there is the clickbait, the sensationalization, and I don't equate sensationalization with misinformation, because you can do really sensational things to get people's attention and then provide that reliable information. But I concede it doesn't often happen that way, but it can do. But I think, yeah, so I do see the connection. It's almost like the discipline starts to have our back. The discipline starts to catch up through what Solange is doing, by giving us not simply a few paywall relieved articles. Hey, look, we're going to waft a few free access ones in front of you. And oh, by the way, if you actually want to follow this up, you have to pay. You start to have the actual data itself. The curse, though, I imagine on the flip side, is that what I've seen with other open access resources is people are making money off and spreading misinformation off that depth of detail. And there's nothing you can really do about it. And I may have told some of you about my little short piece of research I did looking at where on earth the idea came only a few years ago of how the Norse god Loki looked like this particular face mask. And it's all because of a Norwegian language PDF of a interim excavation report of a Vendel period or Merovingian period boat grave, where the author rightly, and in the context of that report, says, could this be the face of Loki on these pendants? And apparently, and that's why all the Etsy stores and all the online images of Loki are heavily dominated by these obscure archaeological finds that were only found 8-9 years ago. So it's not as if they're 19th century, early 20th century. And, I'm just pointing out that, once they're open access, you can't control how they might be mined as evidence for particular narratives, particular commercial or extremist discourses. And so there's a blessing and there's always a curse with that. But I see there's a lot of potential. Getting back to my original response, there's a lot of potential having that depth of knowledge, so that I can go, hey, if you want to follow this up, here's the excavation report, but also here is the actual archive, and here are all the grave plans. And that I think will only help us in the next 5 to 10 years with our digital content creation.
No, I think I definitely agree with you, because I mean, as much as that there are pitfalls and people can obviously use good things for evil, I suppose in some ways I feel, especially in digital spaces, that the more data you have to back up what you're talking about, the more facts, and the more resources that people who are interested can access. I think that that's a good thing. I certainly don't see that in any way as a negative.
Just to go back to that point, can I just add a phrase that the YouTuber Dr. Jackson Crawford, who does Old Norse language and literature, he makes the point that people in that field are so reliant on 19th century translations and what's available via Wikipedia, that anything that's up to date is going to add to the mix and suddenly transform, well, not necessarily immediately, but going to rapidly update the popular slosh of information. It doesn't get rid of all the nonsense, but it really does bring that stuff up to date. And so much of that content, that sort of circularity of Wikipedia, only wanting to use the old-fashioned reliable sources and not, we can get. I'm not blaming Wikipedia, but I'm saying that's kind of that sort of strange sort of, it's open access, but we're only relying on the old information. We can start to build more of that up-to-date material into our discussions.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's at the end of the day, I definitely agree. But I wanted to ask sort of Ellie, that we've been sort of talking about the digital spaces, but like in your paper, you were looking at the news and sort of the images of the dead being seen as clickbait. Do you see sort of what's being spoken about in, the social media world that those same kind of concerns being in the more physical media, I guess I would call the news, perhaps?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's some really transferable debates and conversations to the things you're talking about, Vanessa. So I've also done like a thumbnail analysis and looked at how thumbnails are used to generate engagement to online news websites, and overwhelmingly images of human remains are showing up. It doesn't really matter what outlet you're looking at. It could be particularly left-wing, right-wing, tabloid, quality broadsheet, whatever. There is an interest in getting images of human remains to get eyes on an article. I think maybe the difference with my approach is once something gets put onto social media or is used by kind of amateurs, I guess you could say, the people who are contributing to like online discussions outside of the news. And maybe I'm just being a bit too generous in saying that is the public and they don't have these like rigorous ethical considerations in the same way. But for me, the construction of a news article is hugely based on a collaboration between an archaeologist and a journalist. And both parties should have ethical guidelines that they follow. They will be competing in certain ways, and I appreciate that. But I think that the responsibility of the archaeologist is really important there. And we're the ones giving them the images. So any issues that come with a presentation in online news websites, maybe not any issues, but I could say the majority of issues will likely come from issues with the archaeologists themselves and the presentation that we've come up with. So I think what you were saying, Howard, about people's desire for like long form content and being able to translate data sets to communicate more broadly to get people engaged with something so they can then go off and look into something themselves is the approach that's needed for these online news stories. But at the moment, I think there's a large pitfall with archaeologists who are creating this news content, maybe because they're not seeing themselves as creating content. They're just thinking of how they can talk to a news brand about something that's excited them. And we're seeing a lot of narratives about like surprise and shock and excitement. And it's all this like really nice stuff. You like to see people are happy with their jobs and their profession. But that narrative is repeated. I mean, I've read like nearly 700 news articles about bioarchaeology, and there's an awful lot of it across there. I'd say it's the overwhelming impression you get of bioarchaeology is that we're all very excited about things all the time. Every discovery is changing the field and changing our understanding of things. And oh, it's a mystery why there was a medieval cemetery in this place. And then you go, how is that mysterious? It's just a cemetery.
It's rewriting the history books.
Yeah, exactly. And it's always a once in a lifetime discovery. And it's lovely. I have to remind myself, it is lovely that people feel that happy about their work. But when we think about it in the context of public archaeology and communicating a narrative, then it becomes problematic. And I think that a part of that is that excitement is providing these images of human remains because we know people are interested in them, and giving access to these images that then can be taken by the news and used inappropriately. So it's not completely the archaeologist's fault. It's not completely the fault of the journalists. It's an issue with the way that it's being constructed at the moment. And I think that it's quite apparent across the news and in the way that the way that bioarchaeology is communicated there. And that could be replicated in other areas. Once something is in the news, I know that then influences how the social media discussions happen and the content that you might pick up on. I know a lot of the time Howard will come to a meeting and tell me about something he's read in the news, and then there's a TikTok about it and a blog and whatever else. So I know they all influence each other. So yeah, it can be hard to identify where the kind of issues start to creep in, but when all those things are interacting with each other, if there's any areas where there's like a problematic use of images or a problematic narrative, then it can start to influence lots of other ways of communicating with the public.
Yeah, I mean, I think you are right about sort of everything's all connected. Like so many times, like I'll just Google like archaeology news and see what comes up. And like I know that videos that talk about human remains or talk about bioarchaeology in some way, they do better. Like that's a fact. It's not even a question of it. Like I can kind of be sure if I'm ever concerned about my views, I could put up a video about some bioarchaeology excavation and it'll get seen. But I do find it interesting what you're saying about the news and then the use of images, because I often find that that's for a while where I was getting my images for videos, but then I started going back, if there was like an original article, like, because often you'll get the news, it'll be like, oh, something was published in Nature. So sometimes instead of like taking, you know, from whatever, the BBC, whatever images they've chosen, I was finding myself going back to the original article and being like, oh, maybe there's like a different image or a better image or one that I think will work better. So when it comes, like, I don't know, maybe this is a very broad question to be asking, or maybe a very difficult one, but do you think that because you'd mentioned the responsibility of archaeologists as we're the ones giving people the images and giving people the news, is there the responsibility when archaeologists, you know, I assume the media will be like, send us 2 photos to use in the article or something, to be intentional with the photos and to maybe not be including images of the actual human remains? Or if they do put it, should it be like a requirement that there's some kind of, maybe not quite a pop-up coming up, but something along like, oh, as a reminder that, oh, this is a real individual?
Yeah, I definitely think so. So I think that any images that are supplied to news brands should have the context embedded within them. They should have a caption, because a lot of the time, as a bioarchaeologist, I'll read a news story and I'll be like, well, that's a child's remains, but there's absolutely no context to that. Or there was an article that I showed at TAG that wasn't about human remains in any way, but they'd chosen to use an image from a completely unrelated story as the header for that article just because it was interesting. So I think that it needs to be embedded. I think we need to be willing to say no to journalists and say, if a journalist or a brand or even like a university press office or whoever it is that's trying to force the inclusion of images of human remains, we should be able to say, the way you're approaching this feels uncomfortable. I'm not, sorry, my cat keeps crying. I don't know if you can hear it. I'll just carry on. The way you're approaching this feels uncomfortable. I'm not convinced that you'll use these images ethically, so we won't be providing them. We also, it's not just direct providing of images. So it could be from a blog of an excavation unit, or from university's website. And it's not just the online news that is using images in this way. Like, universities are publicizing themselves to prospective students with images of human remains. Commercial units are trying to get more contracts with them. So there's lots of different ways to get those images. So anytime we're putting out images of human remains, I think it needs to be more considerate. I also think that there's going to be a shift, if people listen to me anyway, in a reduction in images of human remains, and what that then opens up to could be a very different media space. I know for this conference, Howard generated an image of a skull through AI, and I have seen stock images being used of human remains that are obviously not actually human remains, of just like sort of plastic skulls in the ground that look slightly better than a Halloween thing, but not really. And I do think that if we kind of cut off the supply of images of human remains, I'd imagine that AI would be used more and more, and that could open up a whole new world of difficulties. I have personal issues with AI, there's a lot of environmental issues with AI, but I could see that being the way it goes, which is an issue, but equally it isn't a person. So if we're thinking about the respect for the dead because of their humanity, then it takes away some of those ethical considerations.
Yeah, I think those are some really good points. And then I just wanted to ask you, Corinna, about sort of your project and this sort of ideas of sort of addressing ways that we grieve and this kind of toolkit that you've created. Because I know I've definitely, like, it, I will always remember the first time it happened, I made a video about an infant burial, and it was the first time it ever happened that my comments were, I mean, it went viral and was flooded with people who'd lost a child. And it was something that, I mean, I have, you know, no experience with anything like that. I'm not a parent. I've never, you know, lost a child. And so it was something that I felt wholly unprepared for. And I kind of just very much left that comment section alone. But I was very, from sort of then on, aware of how digital content has the ability to sort of generate conversations around grief and bereavement, and in some ways feeling connected to people who grieved, you know, maybe a similar tragedy in the past. Is that something that you see as maybe like a benefit to the work that you're doing and kind of like the mission that sort of that you have?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess one of the things that holds a lot of the projects, what is the strand running through a lot of the projects, including in its title, is the idea of continuing bonds, which is the kind of idea from kind of bereavement counsellors and kind of sociologists that moved away from the model where, you know, we used to think that when someone died, you had to get over their deaths, you had to, you know, disattach and form new attachments, and that was the healthy thing to do. And now we realize that actually that's not really the way that grief works, that actually when someone's died, they're still part of our lives and they're still significant. It's just that they're no longer physically there and that relationship has changed, but that doesn't mean that you need to get over them and they're not significant anymore. And it's actually much healthier to recognize that they still have a role to play in your life. Maybe not in a active way as such, although, you know, it varies person to person, but actually the recognition that, you know, people still recognize the significance that that person has had on them, that, you know, that it's impacted your life journey, and that, you know, you'll always be thinking about them, but that will change. And, you know, some days it's more than others and it fluctuates, and grief isn't a linear journey. So, and actually when we look back across space and time, we can see lots of tangible examples where the dead have been kept close to the living. So we can see this in quite tangible ways. So in my archaeology of the Neolithic of Southwest Asia, it was physically keeping the remains of the dead beneath the house floor, or even keeping the plastered skull within the household. And we see kind of variations on keeping the dead kind of reappearing, whether it's so closer to home might be a lock of hair in Victorian mourning jewelry, for instance. And even today, someone might have someone's ashes on a mantelpiece or made into cremation jewelry or cremation ashes. So I think for me, kind of talking about that idea has really using the past in that way really helps people kind of normalize what their experiences of grief are. I had someone come up to me, they'd seen one of my lectures, and they said, you know, I lost my mum a year ago, and every morning I put on her earrings, and I've never wanted to think about why that is. And she says, now I realize it's because I want to keep her close to me, and that's okay. And it was just really moving that it had that impact of people recognizing the role that, you know, the role that the dead still have to play, and they don't need to just forget about them. It is okay to remember them. Does that make sense to answer your question? I've probably strayed a bit.
No. I mean, I think it does in a way, but I suppose it's like it's like working in some ways, not quite in parallel, but like sort of going towards almost a similar aim of like still keeping the dead like in memory and like in grieving, and you're allowed to grieve. Because I've certainly received comments of people being like, you know, why are you hysterically crying about someone that died X amount of years ago? Like, you're not related to them. And I'm like, well, I don't know. I feel, you know, I'm sad when I hear that someone got brutally murdered 10,000 years ago. Like, sorry, you know. So I always find it quite interesting when I get this almost angry response. People being like, oh, well, you should be upset about people today. Why do you care about people in the past? And I think I really like the point that you were making about sort of keeping those bonds. And I'm like, but they're still in some ways part of maybe like our human story. And I don't, you know, it's maybe not a bad thing. And I think it can, at least how I see it maybe, is that, you know, if you can look into the past and you can kind of grieve, I think it, you know, it normalizes grief and remembrance. So then, you know, when it happens in your own life today, it's not as strange, maybe.
Indeed. And I think as well, kind of doing this work has made me rethink the archaeology as well. So rather than thinking about the role of status and hierarchy when we find human remains, actually, was there a more basic thing going on? Was it, you know, about keeping the dead close? Was it about grief in the past? Can we talk about grief in the past? It might have been experienced in different ways and won't be the same feelings that we feel, because no one's the same. But actually, you know, if we can talk about status and if we can talk about hierarchy, why can't we also talk about potential emotion and potential grief, or you know, those things, which, you know, I think when I was I think back when I was doing my undergraduate degree many millennia ago, you know, it was you know, we got away from the idea of you know, laws of universal behavior, that everyone doesn't react the same, which I kind of broadly subscribe to. So we, you know, we can't put ourselves into the heads of someone in the Neolithic, but by the same token, are we doing a disservice by discounting all of emotion from our studies, or, you know, all of that emotive thinking from our studies, obviously in line with, you know, the great work of Sarah Tarlow and, you know, Ollie Harris and Tim Flor Sorensen and others, you know, that it's, you know, I think it's becoming more acceptable. And indeed, Howard's work, you use my teaching all the time, Howard, you know, with recognizing the, you know, emotive responses that we might be able to recognize.
Yeah,
that's not really digital though, does it? Well,
I mean, but it's all kind of connected. It's one of those things, like, you know, nothing happens in isolation. Like, you know, if we're talking about creating content, you have to sort of go back to the, you can only create content based on some data. So, you know, how are we approaching it? And I mean, I think it's true. Like, you know, often I'll read stuff and people can be quite sort of very factual about it. And I mean, I even know my own research. I mean, I'm just looking at landscapes, but even that, I feel I'm maybe becoming not necessarily conscious of emotion, but, you know, I start to sort of picture the people who live there more as living people, not just, oh, here are their remains, here's what they were buried with, that's their context. It was like, no, like at one point they were living, how were they out in these spaces? So I do think that there is, I mean, at least I felt a benefit in my sort of more academic-y side of life.
Yeah.
But
well, I've just had a flashback to the plenary at TAG about the whole debate on phenomenology. That's probably a discussion for another day.
Yes, no, that's that's a discussion and a half. But I did just want to sort of finish with you, Owen, and then because you can always go on to the next section as well. But I did want to ask, because I mean, it's quite funny that I hadn't clicked that, you know, the sort of the paper that you'd presented was about the Klinefelter syndrome individual, because I've literally just made a video about it, and so I was like, oh, that's like funny coincidence. But it was interesting to see people's reaction to that, and I wanted to sort of ask you, is sort of in the context of, you know, when we're talking about bioarchaeology, you know, is there, how much of a responsibility, and is there a responsibility of researchers or creators that when they're talking about, you know, people who might not necessarily fit into our definition of gender, you know, when there's a bit of diversity, is there a responsibility for us to be talking about that? Or should we maybe not be talking about it if we know that the content being produced will make a lot of men on Facebook angry, like it did in my video? So
yeah, I think we have a responsibility. Archaeology is a storytelling discipline, at least that's my view. It's a science, it's a humanities, it's stories that use both. And, you know, so the Swantaka individual, the individual who Malina et al. Showed to have karyotypically chromosomes that are characteristically intersex and known today as Klinefelter syndrome. This individual was found through when they were putting in a water pipe. So the individual was discovered by archaeology. So something has to be said about them. And when it was first found, Oiva Keskitalo basically left the door open. Is it a double burial, or is it a manhaftiga Hausfrau? I apologize for my Swedish pronunciation, but effectively a mannish housewife. And then further studies has shown that actually they're doing something with gender, which at the karyotype level, we have something similar to, well, we have the same chromosomal arrangement today in society known as Klinefelter syndrome. But in terms of the way that they had gendered their artifacts with jewelry and swords, some people can see that as a blurring of gender lines. Other people can see it as some kind of different gender. That's a whole debate for another time. But in terms of disseminating that online, yeah, the burial made a lot of people very angry and a lot of people very uncomfortable. Primarily because, what do you mean it's a woman with a sword? Which is why Malina et al.'s paper called A Woman with a Sword ? Is chef's kiss, what a name. But yeah, we have a responsibility because people who don't fit in with a modern Western gender binary deserve to know that our past, we've always had it, regardless of how these people conceptualize themselves. There's always been genders beyond the binary that Western society wants to allow today. and indeed what Western and other Western societies might have allowed in the past. I'm going to use the word Western a lot because that's my research frame, and as a setter colonial, if I was in an American context, I wouldn't feel comfortable talking about two-spirit identities, but archaeology can do a lot of stuff there as well, and that's equally important. But yeah, this kind of is going to lead into the critique, so we'll move in there. But a critique of this is the fact that archaeology can disseminate these burials online. So obviously you did your TikTok of it. The Welsh Viking did a video about it, and I've seen it in other places about this Swantaka individual. But equally there is, and this is what I presented at TAG, as you mentioned, there is a meme that has now, I mean, I don't have the quantitative data, but it's been in a lot of places, which satirizes, well, it lampoons Malina et al.'s paper using Wojaks. I won't get into meme iconography here and now, but effectively it uses the lingua franca of internet memes to suggest that Malina et al.'s work is stupid, that trans and non-binary people are stupid, and the idea of them having a past, of us having a past, is stupid. And it does that through meme form to promote the idea that the academy, that archaeology no longer has legitimate discussions of the past, and that actually the traditional past that they imagine exist is the real past, one that is manly man, womanly woman, having 28 babies and, you know, living that beautiful nuclear life. And the reason they're presenting that is because that is the future they want to create. They want anyone who doesn't fit into that mold to be gone. And so they're using memes to spread it, because memes spread online. That particular meme, this always entertains me. I'm not sure if I'd found its ground zero source when I presented it at TAG, but it originates on page 4 of an 111 comment thread forum post about, can the models in this Viking porn game have blue eyes or blonde hair, and it devolves on this porn gaming website forum post into discussions of archaeological ADNA studies, because archaeology gets everywhere. And that's a whole ethical thing, archaeology and porn, but we're not going to get into that now. But moving on then to this critiquing mortuary archaeo media, I'd like to go to you, Ellie, first, if I may, because a lot of my criticism comes from deliberately like far-right figures, alt-right promoters using mortuary memes and mortuary analysis to promote far-right ideology. So a common one would be in gender circles, as I just mentioned, presenting the modern Western idealized versions of men and women as time immemorial, and therefore denying trans people history to deny trans people rights today. The other obvious one is using ADNA, such as what happened with Cheddar Man, to basically be like, oh no, actually the Great Replacement conspiracy is true and whites are getting destroyed and all that kind of, you know, neo-Nazi bullshit. So I deal with people who explicitly do that for that purpose. You obviously deal with the media, which there's a debate if they're explicitly doing that. So I was just wondering what you see in terms of their use and how we can critique that productively as archaeologists.
Okay, all I can think about is archaeology porn being Mortuary Memes 4. So I'll try and get my head back in the game to answer your question. Yes, so I think there are some subtle ways that it happens and some very explicit ways that it happens. Just for context, I've looked at a lot of different news brands, but the 6 that I've looked at the most is BBC, The Independent, The Guardian, The Mirror, and then the 2 that realistically we're probably going to talk about here is the Mail Online and The Sun. And the Mail Online has received a lot of attention from bioarchaeologists and archaeologists as a problematic space for promoting archaeological content. For me, the Mail Online articles are semi-fine. They provide a good amount of context. They're not well written, but they're basically just the press release repeated with a couple of bits of extra context. The Sun is really dodgy and does not promote very good narratives at all. And in fact, it has quite a lot of inherently colonial and racist narratives within its articles that you can pinpoint, but that's kind of been lost from a lot of archaeological conversations. For the media, I think the bigger issue is the environment that it's in. So the archaeology isn't their top priority news story for the day most of the time. They are just reading a press release, repeating it, maybe adding in some extra things, and sticking it on their website. And if it gets popular, like Cheddar Man did, like we've seen some other things, like the black women dying of plague was a big one, like a year ago or 2 years ago now. They can kind of propel into the wider mainstream of the news sites, but most of the time I don't think that's expected. So the articles are pretty basic, but the wider, broader landscape is where you start to see the really dangerous narratives coming in. It's when you're reading an article and there are links to articles about, you know, refugees being illegal, how small boat crossings need to stop, how Keir Starmer, you know, is allowing grooming gangs of only Asian men. You know, when you see these like really racist things, it's just some like things I'm thinking of. It's like kind of current media conversations with Cheddar Man, especially. I wrote about this in my paper, but I think that the fact that it was around the royal wedding with Meghan Markle, and the like completely racist vitriol that was seen across the UK news landscape against Meghan Markle, because that was published at the same time that was going on, that then exacerbated how the archaeology was communicated. So it can then be really difficult for archaeologists, because how can you manage something that is a landscape, that is an environment that you're just trying to promote something in or publish something in that should be separate, but is read by audiences who are reading, you know, if you're on a 10-minute lunch break, you might read 3 or 4 articles, maybe if you're scrolling through the Mail Online or the Sun, and they're connecting them because they are physically next to each other on a web page. And how archaeologists can manage that is really difficult. And something that I've suggested is thinking about risk assessing work before it gets promoted in the press. So thinking about what in this piece of research could be abused and could be twisted, and doing that at the start of the research, but then again right at the point of publication, to try and see what is going on in the zeitgeist, where are the cultural conversations, and how could they be applied to my research by sort of malicious actors, and then how could I try and manage that within my press release and within whatever follow-up public outreach I'm going to do to try and identify where those issues are coming in. And I think that will be quite a big change for archaeology. Again, it involves moving away from this idea of just, oh, isn't it nice we found this thing, to I'm creating a piece of information that could be abused. How can I put this out into the world and make it meaningful? So yeah, it's a very broad question. I think I've tried to answer it.
Yeah, I mean, I hope you would have solved this massive question that archaeologists had since at least the 70s with the development of post-processualism just tonight. But I suppose Howard's raising eyebrows. But I thought we were making progress. No, but it's a really good point you're making, that these papers they're servicing a larger goal, and archaeology is part of that. And the kind of the use of the dead in online spaces, it's kind of a double exploitation in terms of, well, they're being, you know, they're humans are not being treated with human dignity. They're therefore becoming pawns of whatever the media is trying to promote. Vanessa, if I can come to you next, because I think there's definitely a lot of overlap in our research, but you'll also have the benefit of speaking from the position of being a content creator. Obviously, gender, as I mentioned, is a huge topic in archaeology. It has been for a while now, and it is a topic in which the dead are used online to discuss gender. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Elizabeth Weiss and people like that, but I'm sure there are others you can talk to as well who kind of have run up the flagpole this idea that the dead can speak for gender. And are using them in those ways. And I was just wondering how you interact with that through your research, and how, as a content creator, you might push back against those narratives.
Yeah, it is complicated. I'm in the US, and so I'm going through all the turmoil that's happening at the moment, and I can't stop as a woman, a mother, a researcher, a content creator of how am I going forward, because as you know, there's a lot of movements now against human rights that want to silence the LGBTQ plus people that want to silence women, and they want to negate our humanity. As a researcher, I do have the data. There's data to show there's human variability biologically, culturally, and we should accept everyone. That's how we should go forward. As a content creator, I've been asking myself, how should I go forward? I haven't touched much on those topics on my channel, but I am thinking of producing content on that regard. One of the things I will have is a zero tolerance policy. If they harass me or are rude or harass other viewers, I will not engage, I will delete, and I will report and delete. And I think that's one point that we need to start to do, because this is bad faith people. Even those that ask, prove it. Show me the proofs. And then you start to engage. You show the proofs and they continue. Show me the proofs. Tell me what it is. They're just trying to make you tired. They're just trying to make you exhausted. They already have an opinion. It's a tactic to harass us. And we need to understand we do not need to engage with them. We can just ignore, report, delete, and try to interact with those that really want to learn, okay? Because we also have to realize there's a part of the population that we will never get to reach them. But we have to make sure they're the minority. There are those that are confused, that do not have enough information. We can reach to them. But we cannot reach to everyone. And I think that's one of the mistakes. For example, here, a lot of people try to reach to supporters of the regime. We just have to make sure they're a minority. We are the majority, and that we can reach to those that are confused.
Yeah, I think that's a really important message. This, you know, we have a lot of influences as archaeologists, or at least that's what the socially progressive parts of the discipline tell us, and I broadly believe. And we've got to use it responsibly. And you're right; they are trying to tire us out. These people who are opposed to anything and everything that we might stand for, or the way we want to ethically discuss humans in antiquity. From various ontologies as well, and I think it's really important for especially the content creators who might be watching this, that I think it's really good advice. And equally, myself as a non-content creator, a traditional content creator, I should say, when I disseminate blog posts I've written in the past, there are always people who come. I have the other distinction of being, you know, I'm trans myself, which is also not popular online. And is, again, my proof doesn't matter. Whatever I say doesn't matter, because as a trans person, whatever I write, it's already biased, which I think, yeah, it's fun place to be in. But what you're saying there about reaching the people who need to be reached is I think an exceptional point, because while we are critiquing mortuary archaeo media, if we're being critical more broadly, some of it can be very positive. And Karina, I want to come to you, because sort of a lot of your work looks at how archaeo mortuary media is used positively. And I think that might be a really nice place to go after your very compelling and poignant contribution, Vanessa, just to talk about the positives that perhaps can come in terms of educating members of the population directly or indirectly related to the bodies we are using.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say a bit about that in relation to gender first before passing on to Solange, if that's okay, because her work directly feeds into this around disabilities. It's primarily the work of Dulcie Newbury, my PhD student. Well, she's finished her PhD now, who has used the examples of diversity of you know, that sex and gender are binaries, and are quite evidently binaries in a lot of archaeological material. In workshops with communities today, in order to open up dialogue around you know, that challenging of the binary, and it's also had a kind of really fundamental impact on meet the cat fundamental impact on providing a bit of a sense of belonging, in terms of, so a lot of people that have come to her workshops have been from the trans or non-binary community, and it's actually providing a sense of history when that history has often been negated or undermined or downplayed, by saying, you know, actually there is this archaeological evidence for you know, for a non-binary system or non-binary experiences in the past, which then helps to, you know, obviously normalize the idea that we don't just have this, you know, this binary notion, and that, you know, there is individuality and there is difference, and that difference is, you know, normal, isn't a normal as such. So yeah, her work has been really, really groundbreaking in kind of using that sense of the archaeology with contemporary populations, and kind of bringing about an evidence base for the use of the archaeology in that way. So it's kind of all stemmed around the idea of the use of the past for, you know, challenging difficult topics, or topics that people might find difficult to discuss. So gender has been one of them. We're also exploring a project at the moment which looks at food and diet and body image as another one, particularly around, you know, eating disorders. You know, how, again, working with one of my colleagues in psychology, again, how can funerary archaeology help in those, open up those discussions and help think differently about, you know, body image and identity, for example. That's probably a good point, though, to hand over to Solange and your work around disability in this area.
Yeah, perfect segue, isn't it, really? So in the way that Dulcie's challenging ideas of gender in the past, my PhD looked at, well, I focused on a specific time period. I looked at early medieval British English burials, but I looked at disability and funerary treatment. So the idea was to try and figure out if people in the past who may have experienced disability or physical impairment were treated the same or differently than the remainder of the population. And as expected, the answer was the treatment was extremely variable, just as it is today. I think that has value in itself. There's a sort of idea of the past as being sort of barbaric, and you know, in the medieval times, if you were disabled, you were looked down upon and you weren't accepted at all. I don't really know where it came from, but there is that kind of overarching narrative. So the idea was to try and challenge that, and we did. I mean, we found multiple examples of individuals who probably would have experienced some sort of disability in their life, or at least physical impairment, being buried in ways that were very indicative of social inclusion. So in that way, and then I suppose now the hope is to take that more, it was more bioarchaeological data, and move past that into more of a public engagement sphere. So in the same way that Karina did continuing bonds and looking at funerary objects and how funerary objects can help improve our relationships with grief, the same idea we hope to in the future apply to bioarchaeology and disability. So by introducing people now to people from the past who may have been disabled or physically impaired, how can that positively influence opinions today? So that's sort of in the works, isn't it, Karina?
Yeah, we got really close with a bid and putting another one in.
Well, good luck with the second. But yes, no, I'm very familiar with Dulcie's work. Seeing it tag, and we've worked on a paper together with several other co-authors, which is, in the works, as these things often are. But yes, I think your points combined really flow well. That it's important, while we are criticising the way it is used online, that there are these rays of hope. Although, and I'm going to pass to Howard for this, if he's still there. He's disappeared completely from my screen, but I hope, yes, I'm getting confirmation. But there's, it's kind of potentially unfair, potentially maybe too pessimistic to view it as a double-edged coin. For every time archaeology are making these social leaps forward, there's a huge contingent of people saying that this isn't the responsibility of archaeology, it's gone woke, so to speak. These, of course, are the same people who are creating the alt-right, creating the unethical, abusive mortuary memes that we've already touched upon, to do with gender and ADNA and racism and stuff like that. But Howard, as somebody who kind of, promotes ethical archaeology, through your Archaeodeath, and talks about these socially progressive things, and equally platforms the voices of archaeologists who are part of communities such as the LGBTQ plus community, such as the disabled community, such as the people of color communities and stuff like that. You get pushback, I know you do, for the way you handle your platform. So I was just wondering if you can talk about what it's like curating and supporting progressive archaeologies, such as Karina and Solange have talked about, in a sphere which mortuary archaeology and mortuary media online is often used in the opposite way, and which people might have quite strong views that what you're doing is wrong.
Yeah, thank you, Owen, and thank you for those kind evaluation of my efforts, because it doesn't always feel that it makes much progress, but you look back and you think, okay, well, actually that was quite constructive. For every negative comment, there's dozens of positive ones. And from my WordPress blog and my YouTube, which is very small, I close off comments. I don't engage, because I want that to be a more broadcast medium. But on TikTok, I do take it very seriously to make sure that, as best as I can, my videos and the comment sections are curated and they're a safe space, because I think it's very important that I can't let a video that even may have a positive message have a comment section that's an absolute dumpster fire, because then it's undermining the very point. And so I do respond and challenge without trying to amplify the extremist voices. And I think the way you can to mock is one strategy. There's different strategies. You can mock, you can use humor, you can actually take them seriously, but explain in a rigorous and logical way why that perspective is misleading or partial, or dangerous. And I think there's different strategies, and you have to be a bit sort of nimble in not trying to get into a rut. And I don't want to, but equally, I think one of the things I found is we have to be attentive to the issues within our disciplinary communities and within our as well as outside, and we can never be sort of complacent in thinking we're all in the same, speaking in the same place. And certainly I am like 3 days a week I'm woke, and then 1 day a week I'm maybe a white supremacist, apparently, and then another day I'll be destroying the rainforests. I'm making these up, but I'm just saying it's amazing how the comment section can tack to completely different extremes and push me like, well, you're British, therefore you're personally responsible for the contents of the British Museum. That's a common one that we all, and I have to be sort of kind to the fact that I understand there's a lot of rage, there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of anger, and there's a lot of perspectives on a global stage. And so pushing back is not always the way, because I don't know exactly why people are making those comments. And it may be that they're a bot. And maybe that they're very angry because they were a part of the former British Empire, and their main idea online is to have a go at people who sound and look like me, and that's fine at one level. And so it's about trying to make sure I just don't get into a repeat strategy of knocking one particular group. And one thing I've found particularly difficult is I know I've been having a go a lot at American Norse enthusiasts, cosplayers, and faith-based communities. And I always try to make sure that people are aware that I have no beef with anyone of any particular religious group. it's not their identity that I'm having a go at. It's more the misuses within that community of a particular piece of archaeological evidence. So it's a difficult balance, and I constantly try to reflect, and I think we all have to. But I think also we have to, and I think it's important that online communities see this, that we're aware that we're part of the problem, that it's our history as a discipline that has created a lot of these misconceptions in the first place. We are participating in those colonial projects. We are part of the governmental structures of part of empires. We are still living with the legacy of those collections. So we're not sort of saying, hey, look, and I think that's really important that we have to be honest about, is our weight of responsibility on each other, as well as, we're not seen as ivory tower. Oh, look at these people who don't understand the latest theory. We've got to try and remind our audiences we're part of the problem. We're all trying to do our best, and we're all trying to refine and improve our narratives, and particularly for the trans community, for example, or the LGBTQ plus community more broadly, or indeed say particular marginalized groups on grounds of abilities or neurodiversity. I think it's important to remember that we have got such a legacy ourselves to overcome individually and as communities.
Thank you, Howard. Let's just hope nobody edits this out of context to the one day a week I'm a white supremacist, which I've now said.
It's going to happen.
Well, now I've said it, so it's going to be edited out of context as well.
Okay, let's all stop saying.
But I think that really leans into what Vanessa was saying as well, that there are some people we can't reach, there are some people we shouldn't be trying to reach, but we still have a responsibility that there are others who we should. So I remember reading a paper that was, I can't remember the names of it, really bad, but it was about conspiracy theory beliefs, and effectively the idea that once somebody believes a conspiracy theory, even showing empathy to the subjects of that conspiracy theory isn't going to make somebody stop believing in a conspiracy theory. The best way to stop a conspiracy theory is what the authors call information inoculation. I can provide the reference afterwards because I'm very keen on the fact that we're talking about open access and where to get data. And I can't remember the name of the authors, but this information inoculation, where it's practically pointless to argue about something once somebody's entrenched in their position. But if somebody's earnestly trying to get more information, then it's a really good thing, because you can be that person that inoculates them against misinformation before somebody peddling a conspiracy theory about archaeology can get to them. And speaking of archaeological conspiracy theories, moving on to you, Steph, the biggest archaeological conspiracy theory, is she even sad? But
truly does she ever smile? Is she just crying everywhere all the time? Who knows?
But I was wondering, obviously, I'll ask you this question for you to answer, and then lead into the next section about ethical treatment. But on this topic of conspiracy theories, as somebody who is active in TikTok and online spaces, I'm sure you see a lot of the conspiracy theorization, the ancient alien conspiracies, all other sort of like pseudo archaeology in these spaces. And I was just wondering how you can go about, how you do or can think about going about critiquing pseudo archaeology in these spaces, and what the damages of pseudo archaeology are, and how that can lead into the ethical treatment of the dead.
I mean, there's pseudo-archaeology up the wazoo online, I think, to say in a very academic terminology. I mean, the whole reason I'd started putting out content originally 5.5 years ago was because, in those days on TikTok, there really wasn't any archaeologists on there back in 2019, or if there were, they either weren't professionals, or they were men, or they were pseudo-archaeologists, essentially. And so sometimes all three at the same time. I'm not saying all men are pseudo-archaeologists. I'm just saying that there's a lot of men who are pseudo-archaeologists. There's a strong crossover, and that's going to be taken out of context, that I'm a man hater. And you know what? That is in context. No, I joke. But I think something that I was always conscious of was the fact that I am a woman. I present as a woman online, and I was always very conscious of the danger that could be posed by me directly going for any one or a group of people who believe in pseudoscience as people are passionate, for want of a better word, I think, about their beliefs. And I do think that there is a very real danger for, I mean, professionals who seek to address misinformation online. I mean, least amongst them, doxing, people contacting your workspace. Like that, there is in essence a real life consequence sometimes. So I think my approach has always been, well, if they can create content that's popular, I will simply create real archaeology, we'll say real archaeology content that is just as engaging, or at least I hope it's just as engaging, to be kind of like an indirect approach to it. Because I think, especially in areas like TikTok, in, you know, when I talk about digital spaces, I'm talking about, you know, not even a YouTube video, but like incredibly short form content. There's kind of not really, they're not set up for you to really respond. I think YouTube's maybe a better platform for there to be a bit more of a dialogue, a bit more of a response, to have a bit more of a longer conversation where you can kind of address more of the pseudoarchaeology. I feel like on TikTok, on Reels, there's not really that capacity. It's more about just presenting the actual facts rather than being like, oh, in response to XXX video, it just happens to be a video I've posted coincidentally at the same time or aroundish the same time, but I don't directly mention the other person because, you know, as I say, there are real dangers. But I think something I've come to realize as well, that sometimes the pseudoarchaeology isn't necessarily the very obvious ancient aliens theories you see online, or, you know, buried cities that are 10 billion years old, however old they say things are, and, you know, lost continents. Sometimes, I mean, and it's the reason I'm talking about it is because I'm planning on making a video about it, is the newly discovered, or possibly newly discovered, burial of Tutmos II, isn't it? And everyone's like, oh yeah, it's like the first pharaoh's tomb found since Tutankhamun, and it's like, no. Like that, there's straight up like, and it's such, in some ways I think people might look at that and go, well, Steph, that's not really pseudoarchaeology. And I'm like, but it kind of is. It's diminishing the true breadth of archaeology down to a select few, you know, important sites, or the, you know, a select few finds that are considered of value. And also it's just blatantly a lie. It's just not true. And like 2 seconds of research would prove to you that it's not there. So I feel like that there's layers to pseudo-archaeology in a way. And I think, obviously, you know, newspapers saying this is the first pharaoh's tomb found since Tut isn't, you know, as bad as saying, you know, it was a race of white aliens who came down and taught the Egyptians how to build the pyramids. You know, it's a very different space, but I do think it's something to be conscious of as the digital world grows, that I do think that there needs to be some kind of ethical responsibility if you're going to present yourself as an academic online, or as someone with knowledge, that you have a responsibility to make sure that what you're saying is actually the truth and accurate, and not just repeating the newspaper headlines that have suddenly popped up everywhere. If that kind of, hopefully kind of answers your question and sort of some of my thoughts that I have. Sometimes, I don't know, it can be a bit, with how broad sometimes things can be, there's so many different aspects you can discuss. But I mean, that does lead into the ethical treatment of the dead online, definitely, because pseudoarchaeologists, and a lot of these times they'll use human remains to either to push agendas, to push ideas. And I mean, I feel like that there's definitely an ethical responsibility that if you're an academic, to be conscious of the potential misuse. And obviously you can't necessarily, or even possibly, mitigate the multiple ways it can be misconstrued. But I do think it's something that we should be conscious of, not just in creating content, but also when you're maybe speaking to the media in that kind of way, sort of calling back to what Ellie said before about some of that responsibility. And I mean, I say personally, I have some knowledge of the dubious ethics of the sale of human remains online, and our good friend, quote unquote, I don't know, John's Bones, who loves his delightful spine wall and was selling an indigenous skull. And he's my arch nemesis. I think I'm coming out and I'm definitely saying it. He's someone that I loathe and despise for everything that he represents. But I was, in a way, curious, Solange, to kind of talk, to sort of get you to comment on how, what you've got is basically an open resource, but then, when we talk about the ethics of the display of human remains, and you have an account like John's Bones, someone who's selling human remains and using it for profit, is, what are the ethics, what are the angles when you have an open sort of resource like you have that can then be used potentially unethically for profit in a way online?
Yeah, that's a very tricky question, and I do not have an answer for that. It's something that obviously the ADS is aware of, but unfortunately, we're not a policing organization. So the idea, I think, of the work that I did was to kind of try and gauge popular opinion. And by popular opinion, it was mostly a majority of people who responded had some sort of tie to archaeology, was to sort of try and suss out how most people think that we would respond. But it's a tricky one. I mean, we are open access, and as we were saying before, once it's on the internet, you can't really do much about it. I like to think that the positives outweigh the negatives in this case, because we will be disseminating things with as much context as possible. That being said, anyone can grab a 3D model and say what they want about it. Some of the stuff I did a bit of research for my thesis on places that currently disseminate 3D data, 3D bioarchaeological data, and Sketchfab is a world of its own. Some of them are fantastic, and some of them will literally just be like skeleton, and that's it. So I think, unfortunately, there's not an answer for your question. I think it's still important to have things be open access, and the work that I did in terms of the suggestions of like the suggestion of having the pop-up and stuff. I don't know, I'm not a technical person, so I don't know how hard that is going to be to actually implement, but you can tell that people believe that that is a good idea, which is positive. So that would be my hope, would be, I guess most people who go to the ADS are generally going to have some sort of archaeology background. But yes, we run the risk of things being misused, and we can't really do too much about it except for ask people to consider the identity of the deceased. So it's unfortunately not a very great answer to your question, because there's not much we can do. Besides,
but I suppose
things like besides encouraging positive use and respectful reuse, which is, I suppose, all we can do, really.
I mean, I think, though, that that is still a response. I think to say that there's not really a response in and of itself, that you can only do as much as you can. Like, there are obvious limitations.
Yeah.
But I suppose it's just important that those conversations are being had, and it's still being thought about, at least.
Yeah, for sure.
That's...
Yeah, it's not just willy-nilly, anyone can download anything without thinking about it first. Yeah, that's the idea behind the research anyways.
Yeah, no, I definitely, I think that there's, in some ways there's extremes, because you'll see, I mean, I only ever think about John's Bones, and recently there's been a sort of uptick again in people re-criticizing him. I've been seeing it, a couple of videos coming up, and it's really just kind of come from a place of, wait, guys, isn't it a little bit weird to have a wall of spines? Like, it's just as simple as that. It's not even like the people doing the quote unquote calling out now aren't necessarily like, they're not academics in any way, they're not bioarchaeologists, it's just regular in some ways people. I think one of them I've seen was a guy, he did like a uni course on it or something, like bioarchaeology, and he was like, yeah, this account came up, and I was like, that's a little sus, that's a little weird. But I did want to ask kind of, Karina, sort of, I know like your work, again, it's not necessarily fully in these online worlds, but you do talk, I mean, in some ways it is about, the ethics of how we approach death. Do you think that there is, a benefit to sort of understanding grief and having this toolkit that you have to then get maybe more people who, without a bioarchaeology background to start maybe questioning maybe the more normalized, non-ethical treatment of the dead that we see online?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, the more we, what am I trying to say? I guess the more we display our kind of ethical treatment, hopefully the more it will encourage others, and actually the more we can encourage people to be familiar with what is appropriate can only be a good thing, right? So like going, but we kind of almost come like full circle, like going back to the conversations from the start of the call. We're talking about not just using images of human remains for the sake of it, about being selective and thinking about how we use them. And I think, there has been a big shift in that. I mean, I know now even in my, in my own teaching, and I'll think carefully about whether that needs to be an image of a human remain or not. So, and then thinking about the public realm, yeah, absolutely. I just think the more we can practice good behavior and challenge that what isn't ethical is good, and the more we can normalize talking about it, is just inevitably going to help.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is that need to normalize it. And again, it's that idea of not wanting to make it seem like that we're ivory towers in a way, that, that we are the holders of what is ethical, that it's kind of all of our responsibilities in a way to consider ethics. Like you don't have to be an academic, you don't have to be a bioarchaeologist or someone, who's gone to university even to, maybe question or become aware of non-ethical practices in sort of the display of human remains. Do you I mean, I don't know if this is, it's not necessarily, I mean, I'll give you the question, Karina, kind of in the way that we talk about displaying the dead online, do you think that that also connects to how we display the dead in museums? Because I've certainly received comments from people being like that, that it never kind of clicked that the remains they were seeing in a museum were a real person until they'd seen a video of mine, and they're like, oh yeah, like every time I walk into a museum and I see human remains, I think of you, Steph, and I'm like, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean for that to happen. But that kind of idea of, how we as a society in some ways have kind of cut ourselves off from death, the way we grieve our most recent dead, to how we display them, to how we present them online. Do you see like there being a connection?
Absolutely. So I think 2 points there. So back when I used to like do a field trip to a British museum, one of the things I'd do would be to contrast the way you go into the Egyptian gallery, all lots of bright lights, everything on display, not much respect at all, and then taking them to see Lindo Man, who's in a quiet, darkened corner, out of the way. You actually have to choose to see the human remains. So aside from the issue about whether those remains should be in the museum at all, which is a whole different debate, but we do see more sensitive ways of including remains in the museum than others. And it's really interesting that even today there's this big juxtaposition in the different human remains, which again probably ties into awful colonial narratives about the different values that people have placed on the different human remains, which is awful, but it's still there to see. And this that point about grief, actually one of the things that inspired me to get into this a very long time ago was actually Howard's work. Yourself and Mel Giles have, both talked about how for a lot of people their first encounter with mortality can be through, museum displays and museum remains. Howard, shall I hand over to you?
Yeah, if Howard wants to add on to that.
Yes, I mean, so there's a number of different intersections between museums and the online digital dead and their display, and we can't equate them. The dead are online; they're out there in a way that we can't control, but equally, both by setting example and best practice, and showing students and future generations how we do it, we should be thinking every time we show human remains. I started off on TikTok, for example, not showing any human remains at all, and I've slowly let them creep in, but I a couple of errors where I missed saying content warning, but always give people a content warning if it's possible, and to make sure that you don't know where people are, where they're coming from in terms of their emotional state, their cultural background, etc., etc. When they're going to encounter these. So I think we do have a responsibility there. But also, there's a further aspect to this is I try to use some of my museum display content. So I go to museums to critique these displays. I've done one that recently that really got people hot under the collar, and it was deliberately done, which is going to the National Museum of the Royal Navy and doing an upbeat Pirates of the Caribbean soundtrack while showing a diorama. This has nothing to do with burials, but a diorama of a British Navy West African squadron ship intercepting a slaver, and trying to make it out like British Navy coming to the rescue, and obviously to set up this challenge, critiquing the museum's narrative of the Royal Navy's role in the in the transatlantic slave trade and its then subsequent suppression attempts, and people are getting very angry with me, accusing me of that narrative. And I think sometimes we have to be disruptive of the museums themselves, to use our social media presence to call out of this is outrageous, but to bring the conversation to the fore. Oh, here's another body. Here's not in a disrespectful way, but to make people think. And sometimes that puts us in the firing line, but I think it can be really constructive to get people to think about what the heck was I seeing. As Steph was saying, I didn't realize that was a body until I saw a video about it being a body, and I think that, I don't want to be constantly online bashing museums or bashing heritage sites. I want to encourage people to visit them, but I don't want to be just doing banal, here's a hidden gem of a site. Oh, and look, there's some amazing, you've got to sort of move between tempos and roles in our content. And sometimes I think we should be quite hard hitting about what the heck are we doing here, that this old fashioned display is still around without any critical consideration of the ethical issues we're discussing. So there's all manner of there's inevitably hypocrisies and double standards and triple standards between online content and physical displays, but I think we can use our online content to not buy into that establishment practice of displaying the dead in a casual way, and to make people feel a little uncomfortable. And I think Steph does that very well with some of her content, which is trying to play with people's emotions or prompt people to react in ways, perhaps not in a contrived way, but in a thoughtful way about what they think about these things.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you could point most obviously to some of my recent content where I've specifically had, I don't know, quotes or whatever when people, maybe have said negative things and about human remains, and then I've kind of done but they were like a real person, this is it. And it was maybe originally had perhaps more wholesome connotations, but then people got so enraged because they assumed that I was saying the first, quite dismissive, rude, disrespectful comments. But then it makes the videos go viral every time. So I kind of keep doing them because I think it does keep that conversation happening. And I'm like, if you watch the full 11 seconds, the whole context will become clear. But if you can, it's not my fault you can only get through 3 seconds before angrily typing out a message about how I'm a terrible person. But I think it is important to be having those conversations. And in some ways, I don't know, if I can perhaps facilitate some of that and also go viral, it's maybe not a wholly negative thing, if perhaps a little manipulative of people's emotions ever so slightly. But you know, that's social media, isn't it? So I don't know how you find it, Howard.
I can find I just did an example today, which it's not viral, but it's going reasonably big for me. And because I just called out another creator for stacking human skulls up on a counter and saying Jenga, it's like Jenga with skulls. And I said, this is outrageous, this is disrespectful, this is unethical. And then and if you watch the first few seconds, you'll think this is me calling out someone with a collection of human remains, but they're chocolate skulls that she's carefully painted to look like real skulls, and she's called the Edible Museum, and she makes, you know, chocolate toads and chocolate human feet, you know, and all sorts of gross things as chocolate. And so I did this, and this needs to be in a museum, and what I would suggest is you post them all to me, and via my stomach I will transport them safely to the nearest museum. So it's a joke, but it simultaneously highlights there are people selling stuff online, and we should be attentive to it with the humor that most people got through the 30-40 seconds to realize it was a joke, of realizing that I was just trying to make a bid to get more chocolate sent to me by post. But you know, I think there's different styles. Whether that's really funny or not, I don't know, but that's up to the individual viewer. But my point is, there's different ways we can do the message. And I did another one recently with good old Marsha, who's the John's Bones assistant, showing different grotesque specimens in his museum, and I just sort of did a parody of, Marsha, show us some ethically sourced human remains. Marsha, why are you now running away? You know, sort of as a joke, not trying to pick. But then you see that has problems, because I could then be seen as mocking or picking on this person who I don't know called Marsha. But of course that's not my intention. But there's all manner of ways things can backfire. So any attempt at humor, you know, I think can be good, but it can also lead to misunderstanding. So yeah, we've got to be careful.
Yeah, I think there's a conversation, I mean, obviously to be had about the ethics of sort of the actual display of human remains, but then also perhaps the ethics of our responses to that. And I think that sort of pivot slightly and ask sort of Vanessa, because you sort of, you know, you've already spoken sort of about the ethics and maybe how you've approached it and what you've seen online, but I want to know if you had any like more thoughts, because I thought it was really interesting, like your research that was finding, you know, which videos were displaying human remains, which videos weren't displaying human remains, and sort of some of that maybe like data that you'd come across and your thoughts of it.
Yeah, there was one in particular, like I have here the database. The video is called Whose Bones Are These? Investigating a Classroom Skeleton. So basically it's a skeleton of a young adult woman that came from India. She was sold to the United States. Like her, there's a lot of individuals whose remains were sold from India and came to the United States. That brought a lot of comments about the morality of this. And there's one comment which I'm going to read, which encapsulates the morality of the situation. She says, so they comment, I find it both interesting and disturbing that people can so easily dissociate a real skeleton from the human being it once was. As they say in the video, it was just seen as some skeleton on string and not the remains of a human being that felt and had meaningful thoughts like the rest of us, before they made the effort to learn more about the person. They continue on the line this and ask that we have to remember that they were human beings. They had loved ones, that maybe those loved ones are no longer here to remember them or tell their story. So that's was some of the comments I found. But I also want to go back a bit, the sale of human remains and 3D replicas of those human remains. And I think that's rooted in a systemic problem where our societies value more money than human lives. That's why they're being sold. One of the things that has been suggested by researchers, including by me and Francisco Alscredus, is the adding a non-commercial license associated with the 3D digital replicas to try to guarantee that those models are not then sold eventually by third parties. Another thing is the ethical conversations with the public, which has been mentioned. And it's very important because Francisca Alves and I, we did 2 surveys, one in Portugal and another one in the United States. And to see what the opinion of the public regarding the creation, use, and dissemination of 3D digital replicas. The majority had a very positive outlook about it, but they were very assertive that it had to be used for research and education. It had to have some kind of control, like a registration and login to get access to those remains. And also contextual information. And this was independently of how they saw those digital replicas. Because one of the questions we asked was, do you consider the 3D digital replicas to be the same as the human remains or not? In Portugal, the opinions were divided. In the United States, mostly considered to be the same as a human remain. When we divided the analysis between genders, it was quite interesting because Portuguese women and American women, they all thought, the majority thought that it was the same as a human remain, versus the men. The men thought that it was an object. And this is really interesting, and I think this is rooted in our patriarchal society and toxic masculinity, where women are more empathic, they're more towards the home, taking care of your children, taking care of the older members of the family. So we have a more empathic, or at least what is expected of us women. In a toxic masculinity, men are for themselves. It's a dog-eat-dog world. So it may be why they see it more as an object. So it's quite interesting. This is me assuming why, because we didn't ask them why, but it was quite interesting that division of opinion between genders in both countries.
That is very interesting. I definitely agree with you that that's certainly raises some interesting thoughts, I think, as you were saying about the, the impact of the patriarchy in a way, and how it sort of influences how human remains and then sort of the ethics around them are. Yeah, no, that I feel like I need to sit and like almost digest the information. I'm kind of here going, right, okay, this is what's being said. But yeah, no, that is really interesting. And then, because I know we're getting kind of close to the end, but I did want to ask.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to go. It was wonderful. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Bye.
I'll see you later. Okay, bye.
Bye. But I did just want to ask, again, you, Ellie, like you've obviously already spoken about ethics. That's kind of almost your whole thing. But I wanted to know, like, sort of from the research you've done and kind of your thoughts when it comes to the use of, images of human remains in the media, maybe in press releases, even online. Do you think that there should be like one set of ethics that sort of applies to all media, or should it be able maybe to be a little bit flexible and it depends on the type of media, like a press release gets certain things, like maybe if it's going to a more academic-y media side of things rather than just, the front page of the Daily Mail kind of situation? I don't know if you have any.
That's a good question. I think it has to apply to everyone. So if we go back to like Cheddar Man, the huge like backlash, the like debunking movement came from a New Scientist article, which was trying to talk about like the accuracy of ancient DNA testing, and it was written for an audience that was expected to have like a broader understanding of science and an interest in it that could handle some maybe more nuanced debates. Then it got picked up in the Mail Online and it became this huge movement that now gets quoted all the time still on X and on social media that, the researchers lied. So anything that we put out there, we have to expect anyone to be reading it and any outlet to be picking it up. So it does kind of then mean we have to apply a sort of blanket ethical approach to any content that we put out there. I think that there are some competing ethical priorities, if I could say that, between public archaeology and bioarchaeology, because public archaeology, like you say, is trying to remove this gatekeeping and the ivory towers, and is trying to share our research, and a part of that would involve sharing images of the research that we're doing, which involves human remains, and then the bioarchaeology is trying to protect the humanity in that and make sure that there is appropriate context given. So I think there should be an ethical approach that, with any ethical approach, probably needs quite a lot of different people to contribute to it, and will need to evolve and consider a lot of different ideas and theoretical approaches, and probably needs much more influence from like Indigenous perspectives than I could offer, and would need a sort of co-curation and co-creation across the discipline to develop. But I do think that it would need to be as much as possible, and I think this with a lot of archaeomedia, we need to appreciate that the media is a really weird space, the online news media, where it looks to the audience like it's coming from one source. All archaeological content that a Daily Mail reader reads comes from the Daily Mail, but it's been fed into by hundreds, thousands, however many archaeologists, or not even archaeologists, various researchers looking at archaeology. We have to think about how we are contributing to this broader picture that then gets anonymized and to an audience is translated in a way that maybe when we're thinking about publishing on our one piece of research, we're not thinking about that bigger picture. So yeah, I definitely think broader ethical guidelines would be applicable. But I have personal confusion, I guess, around the ethics of inclusion of human remains, because I think there are some very valid reasons to include images of human remains. I am a bioarchaeologist because I experienced human remains and became interested in them, and then went to university to study archaeology. So I appreciate that they can be inspiring, they can be fascinating, they can really connect you with ancient people, but equally they can be misused. I mean, you have to find ways to do it respectfully.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's a delicate balance, because I feel, having been in this online space almost before it existed in a way, like when I first started creating, there wasn't like archaeology TikTok, it just didn't exist. And so in some ways, I've almost felt I've been creating my own ethics based upon what I've, experienced on field schools. And as someone who doesn't have, which might shock my audience, that I have no formal qualifications or background in bioarchaeology. I just happen to have been on a couple of bioarchaeology digs. And, through my professional career, I've learned about it, but I don't have that formal training. So even me, in some ways, when I've, created content or I've spoken about it, I've been like, oh, in some ways, what are my personal ethics? What are the ethics of academia? But then what are my ethics when I am trying to make archaeology more accessible? And it is true, there's a complete difference in viewership when you start including actual human remains. But I mean, I personally do like including artist interpretations. I know sometimes maybe in academia it's maybe a little bit looked down upon, but I think especially for a non-specialist audience who maybe they're not necessarily looking at the absolute facts. They're not interested in, oh, I want to see a close-up of these saw marks or something. They want to get an impression of an individual, that an artist's interpretation that in some ways could either be a drawing of the bones themselves, like the sketch that you do on sites. Sometimes those are published, and I kind of like including those actually. But then, yeah, a sort of a further interpretation of the burial is sometimes just as impactful, sometimes if not more impactful, because they look like a real person versus just some skeletal remains. That I think maybe we can push for ethics in that way, but there'll always be that, maybe not even an undercurrent, but a very obvious current of the sort of, ooh, human bones, isn't this weird and wacky, guys? There's not, I don't know, there's many different sides, I think, to balance, and it's not set in stone, I think, what that balance is. And then just to ask you, Owen, because, you know, you've obviously done this whole paper about human remains and sort of how they've been quite twisted and manipulated in some ways by the right wing, quote unquote. What are your kind of thoughts on, you know, ethics in that way?
Yeah, thanks. I'll keep it brief because we are starting to run a little bit over. I knew everyone would bake future directions into their answers already, so we were kind of like, yeah, we need to spend 20 minutes on that. But yes, just on your last point, I really need to mention in terms of when human remains and artist impressions of human remains are presented, I found it fascinating that in Price et al.'s now infamous 2019 paper about BJ581, the paper had artist impressions. The supplementary material had a photograph of the bones laid out on nothing but a white background. And it was just a really interesting, I don't have time to get into it now, but a really interesting way of presenting this story was to have artists in the main paper and a cold clinical presentation in the supplementary material. But yes, in terms of what we're saying about the ethics, so a lot of what I do is looking at memes. I say a lot of what I do, what I've done for this particular paper and research area is looking at memes that use both images of archaeologists, sometimes AI skeletons, which is for numerous reasons unethical, because where are they drawing that data from? Dead people. But also then actual images. So there was two memes in particular I looked at, both of which used text kind of like, how come when archaeologists dig up people, it's always man or woman? And it's like, it's not. But okay, sure. But they had no context. These were images of two children, one of which potentially had been indentured and died by violent means from 18th century America, 17th century America, and the other was from Bronze Age Turkey. Reverse image searching got you the academic papers they were in, because as Ellie was saying, these images had started in academic papers, and then you had a child who died 3,000 years ago with a Turning Point logo imprinted on their ankle, and then used to say people like me don't deserve our rights, which is just such an insane progression of archaeomedia. And ethically, what do we do with it? Which does lead into the future direction points, which we've all talked about. But I did want to end, if I may, by asking everyone to say one sentence on a future direction. And I will take the liberty of going first because it follows on what I was saying. Of sometimes we need to, you know, it's also what Vanessa said, sometimes we need to know when to no platform, and a future direction could be better training in ethically no platforming individuals and media as content creators and as archaeologists. I'm going to keep going across my screen. So Howard, you have the honor of going next. One sentence.
I think we need to work, well, agreeing with you, of course. I think that's really important, but if that's not my sentence. Can I have another one? I believe that we need to improve how we're responsive to ongoing shifting socio-political, cultural contexts in when we are creating our content online, because it's really fast moving, not just in terms of discoveries, but also in terms of the conversations in which our data and ideas are being taken.
Thank you. Ellie?
I'm going to say for archaeologists to take more responsibility for our actions and for our outputs, and not be maybe a little bit too willing to blame other people, whether that's the public, so people on social media, the actual media, politicians, whoever, for abusing archaeology, and think about what our responsibilities and our role in that is.
Thank you. Karina?
Yeah, in a similar vein, I was going to say that we need to put out more positive stuff and more content that we're happy with and is well, you know, researched and well grounded, so that, you know, those voids aren't being filled. And that's a note for myself as well.
Solange?
With my ADS hat on, I would say encouraging open access to research, including 3D models of human remains if they're well contextualized, but probably most importantly is encouraging the respectful reuse of those 3D images.
And then Steph, a sentence, and then I'll let you close out as well.
A sentence. That if we're not in online spaces trying to have these ethical conversations, it will be filled by other people with less honorable means. And I think that in a way, it's our ethical responsibility to be in these spaces, for in some ways for better or worse. And I do think that that needs to be acknowledged by, I say academia, meaning like higher education, by universities, that this is important. It is part of the work of being a researcher. It's not just, oh yeah, we're on X posting about whatever. Like, no, we need to be actively engaging, and that needs to be recognized as work. I think we'll say it's a sentence, it's fine. But yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed the conversation, and I wanted to say thanks again to Howard and Ellie for, putting this all together, asking me to be a co-chair. It's been fun. And especially because I couldn't attend TAG myself, it was kind of nice to sort of hear a little bit more about your research and sort of everyone's thoughts. And I think, yeah, that there's been some really great points raised. And it's been, I think, good to kind of see that I feel like on the whole, everyone seems to be basically saying the same things, which I think is a very promising sign. Maybe people will be like, no, we should be arguing. Like, no, I think it's good that we can kind of come together from quite, I don't want to say different, but, from different areas, different slightly angles, but that we can all kind of reach not like a common consensus, but all be kind of thinking about the same things. And I think that's so important, because no archaeological work is done in isolation. So these conversations that we're having, I think, are so incredibly important to be having. And I think that's me speaking both as a content creator and as a PhD student. I'm kind of aware I'm balancing my two hats at the same time, which keep getting mixed together. But yeah, I'll hand back to you, Howard.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for sharing it in an impeccable way. I couldn't have imagined. I haven't actually seen an online discussion chaired in such an effective fashion before. I think this is a phenomenon, to be honest, regardless of the subject we're addressing. But seriously, that was serious, but also seriously, we really have taken this structure forward. And, I think this is really something we could have never done either online alone or without a conference session first, but also we couldn't have done at a session in a conference. It just would have not worked this way. So I think I'm really pleased we've had this opportunity. Through happenstance, a lot of people can't make it. And I just want to say that we are going to host a follow-up involving some of the individuals who presented in Bournemouth. Actually, only one of them, Frederick Toserhammer. At least I hope he can join us next time for a Mortuary Memes 3, as well as digital presenters, Ava Sutton Butler, who obviously co-presented with Karina, Robin Lacey and Rosie Crawford. And in addition, we've invited Nicole Salomon, who is a doctoral researcher at the University of Leicester, who was at TAG, but not as a presenter, and the TikTok creator Teninja Kellenbarger, who is does a lot of Egyptian and Greek and ancient Mediterranean content, and she's agreed to give a presentation at that. So, and maybe you will keep going with further ones, but it's not that we're trying to restrict the conversation, but I think this is probably the right kind of size for a 2-hour discussion, and I just want to thank you all for attending and contributing, both those here and those who had to leave, and thank Ellie for making all this possible, really working behind the scenes and dealing with my madness and keeping it all on track, and yeah, I think we could perhaps end it there, but thank you everyone.
Thank you, really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, guys.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you
Bye.
all.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Follow ArchaeoDeath on YouTube, TikTok, WordPress, and a host of other social media.